So glad that you chose to join us today for daily. We're going to read Acts chapter 19, part 2, and we're going to pray before we begin. God, I thank you for your word. Please help us to understand what we read today and to apply it to our lives so that we can become much more like your Son, Jesus, in whose name we pray. About that time, serious trouble developed in Ephesus concerning the way. It began with Demetrius, a silversmith who had a large business manufacturing silver shrines of the Greek goddess Artemis. He kept many craftsmen busy. He called them together along with others employed in similar trades and addressed them as follows. Gentlemen, you know that our wealth comes from this business. But as you have seen and heard, this man Paul has persuaded many people that handmade gods aren't really gods at all. And he's done this not only here in Ephesus, but throughout the entire province. Of course, I'm not just talking about the loss of public respect for our business. I'm also concerned that the temple of the great goddess Artemis will lose its influence, and that Artemis, this magnificent goddess worshipped throughout the province of Asia and all around the world, will be robbed of her great prestige. At this, their anger boiled, and they began shouting, "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" Soon the whole city was filled with confusion. Everyone rushed to the amphitheater, dragging along Gaius and Aristarchus, who was Paul's traveling companions from Macedonia. Paul wanted to go in too, but the believers wouldn't let him. Some of the officials of the province, friends of Paul, also sent a message to him, begging him not to risk his life by entering the amphitheater. Inside, the people were all shouting, some one thing and some another. Everything was in confusion. In fact, most of them didn't even know why they were there. The Jews in the crowd pushed Alexander forward and told him to explain the situation. He motioned for silence and tried to speak. But when the crowd realized he was a Jew, they started shouting again and kept it up for about 2 hours. "Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians!" At last the mayor was able to quiet them down enough to speak. "Citizens of Ephesus," he said, "everyone knows that Ephesus is the official guardian of the temple of the great Artemis, whose image fell down to us from heaven. Since this is an undeniable fact, you should stay calm and not do anything rash. You have brought these men here, but they have stolen nothing from the temple and have not spoken against our goddess. If Demetrius and the craftsmen have a case against them, the courts are in session and the officials can hear the case at once. Let them make formal charges. And if there are complaints about other matters, they can be settled in a legal assembly. I am afraid we are in danger of being charged with rioting by the Roman government, since there is no cause for all this commotion. And if Rome demands an explanation, we won't know what to say." Then he dismissed them, and they dispersed.
So the town of Ephesus had a patron deity called Artemis, or Diana. And actually, the temple that was in Ephesus was huge. They actually said that it was like one of the 7 wonders of the world. It was a pretty important thing in the community. And there's trouble that kind of arose in Ephesus because of this. It says in verse 24, it began with Demetrius, a silversmith who had a large business manufacturing silver shrines of the Greek goddess Artemis. He kept many craftsmen busy. So he's like an important businessman who a lot of people work with and work for, and he's the genesis of this problem that happens. He gathers all these people together, and he says this in 25 and 26, "Gentlemen, you know that our wealth comes from this business. But as you have seen and heard, this man Paul has persuaded many people that handmade gods aren't really gods at all." He says, this is really going to cut into our bottom line. What this guy is saying about this guy, Jesus, it's about the idea of like there being like a God who's alive and present, not like the handmade gods that we're making, right, of Artemis. And this is really going to mess up our bottom line. It's going to mess up our business. Not only that, But there was also kind of like this underlying fear that he tapped into, and it's something that's gone throughout human history. And he says this in verse 27 and then in 28. He says, I'm also concerned that the temple of the great goddess Artemis, this magnificent goddess worshipped throughout the province of Asia and all around the world, will be robbed of her great prestige. And it says in verse 28, at this their anger boiled, and they began shouting, great is Artemis of the Ephesians! Great is Artemis of the Ephesians! He had tapped into a human emotion of fear of their way of life being changed. And they're like, no, like that's the whole thing. That's how we live is we're important because of this whole thing about Artemis. And the idea of kind of stirring this up and shaking it up caused this huge commotion. I mean, literally the whole city goes crazy. They end up going into this big giant amphitheater they have. Fear is driving the entire thing. It's not a logical consideration. It literally says in verse 32, I love this. See if you haven't saw similar things happen in our culture in recent years. It says everything was confusion. In fact, most of them didn't even know why they were there. I've seen that in some of these crazy situations of people like the riots and stuff, and they like ask people like, why are you out here protesting? They're like, I don't know. I just came out with other people because I saw them and I thought I'd march with them. And you're like, wait a minute, what? Like both sides, it doesn't matter. And it's so funny because it was tapped into this fear of like their culture changing. And that's, of course, what Jesus was doing at this time, right? The Christians luckily convinced Paul, don't go in there, okay? If you go in there, it's going to turn out bad. You might get lynched for sure. The worry was that it was going to mess up their money, or it was going to mess up their way of life. It was going to mess up their traditions. And this is still common to this day. As the gospel begins to spread, both in our country and around the world, countries, communities, individuals will push back against it violently, not because they don't believe that Jesus is actually who he says he is or think that it's wrong, but for fear that it will mess up their money or it will mess up their way of life that they're used to. And it's true. Both are true. Understanding who Jesus is, there are a lot of businesses in the world that honestly, if they are to put themselves into obedience to Christ, you'd realize we have to change our business practices. You, right? As far as becoming a follower of Jesus, you're like, well, I have to change the way I spend my money. Yeah. Not only that, but there are tons of cultural practices where then like when you bring the message of Jesus to it, it's like, oh, even though this has been common and normal for us, our culture all agrees this is okay. We've realized Jesus says it's not okay. We go, wait a second, so we're going to have to change our way of life? Yeah. You, as a Jesus follower, you might have family tradition, you might have family culture, community culture that kind of tells you, this is kind of what we believe, this is kind of what we think, and then you realize Jesus doesn't agree with that, and you have to decide, oh, wow, now I have to uproot kind of my way of life and shift it to follow this Jesus. In fact, some of you guys, you've noticed this. You've wondered why your friends and family got angry when you got serious about your faith. And the reason why is because it did this to them. They were afraid that it was going to mess up kind of their tradition and their culture, their way of life. And my question for you today is this. Will you not just follow Jesus when it's easy? Giving him our sin, that's easy, right? Experiencing salvation, forgiveness, that's easy. But will you follow Jesus when it starts to affect your money? And you realize, I'm going to have to change the way I spend my money. I'm going to have to change the way that I buy things. I'm going to have to change the way I do business. Or will you still follow Jesus when it starts to affect your way of life? When you realize that some of the natural habits of who you are, or maybe some of like the family traditions or the culture that you've been part of, or some of just the normal ideas of what you think about social issues, you start reading about Jesus and you realize, oh, he disagrees with this. Will you still follow Jesus when it threatens your way of life? I want to encourage you to act, okay? As you know more and more about Jesus, and as you start to feel that push against either your money or your way of life, I want to encourage you to trust Jesus, to be willing to let go of maybe the way of life that you had rooted in your history. Maybe your family was always this way, or your culture was always this way, and you recognize that it doesn't line up with Jesus. I want to invite you to take and to lay down some of your identity and instead take up Christ as your new identity. I'm telling you for sure, as you do, as these Christians did, as the people in Ephesus did, as throughout history did, there's much more blessing in following after him, even though it might be scary initially to let go of some of our culture and instead make our identity him. Move forward by faith today.